How come the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament were written in Greek instead of Hebrew? Were your ancestors who were enslaved in the Americas allowed to read as slaves? So, what was the Most High Yah going to do? Before we explore these questions, let us first go back to the beginning of creation during the time when there was only one language. Now, secular history does not reveal the origin of the Hebrew language, or for that matter, of any of the most ancient languages known, such as Sumerian, Akkadian, Aramaean, and Egyptian. This is because those languages appear already fully developed in the earliest written records men have found. The Bible is the only historical source giving reliable evidence of the origin of the language that we know as the first language, which was Hebrew. And it was, of course, spoken by the Israelite descendants of Abraham the Hebrew, according to Genesis 14, verse 13, who in turn was descended from Noah's son Shem. Therefore, is it reasonable to believe that Shem's language was affected when the Most High confused the language of the disobedient people at the Tower of Babel? No. Shem and his family, including his father Noah and his wife, had not been disobedient. Shem and his family had not engaged in building an idol in the form of a tall tower into the heavens. Therefore, Shem's language was not affected when the Most High Yah confused the language of the disobedient people at Babel. Shem's language would remain the same as it had been previously, the one language that had existed from Adam onward, according to Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. This would mean that the language that eventually came to be called Hebrew was the one original tongue, the original language of mankind. But later, from about 300 BCE to about 500 CE, was the age of Kini, or Common Greek, a mixture of differing Greek dialects. Kini became the international language. It had a very distinct advantage over the other languages of the day, in that it was almost universally known. Kini means common language or dialect common to all. Now, Matthew, the first book of the Gospels, was written originally in Hebrew, but later was translated into Greek. And of course, the primary reason for that, the Greek Septuagint, was mainly to benefit the Jews, especially those of the diaspora, who no longer spoke the pure Hebrew, but were familiar with Greek from the places that they had been dispersed to. In fact, Old Hebrew eventually began to be replaced by certain Greek terms in origin. One example being the word synagogue, which is a Greek word meaning meeting together. So certain Greek words started to come into the Hebrew language among the Hebrew people during the first century. But Hebrew was still a very dominant language. It was still spoken. It was still a living language. But it was slowly being dwarfed by the Greek language because Greek came to be a universal language. And that was also due to the Roman Empire. What is interesting also is that even though Greek was becoming the common language among the Roman Empire, actually Latin was the language of Imperial Rome when Yeshua was on the earth. It was the official language of Palestine, even though it was not the popular language of the people. How widespread the use of Greek was can be seen from the fact that the decrees of the imperial governors and of the Roman Senate were translated into Greek to be distributed throughout the Roman Empire for everyone, the common people, to know what was going on. So even though Latin was the official language of the Roman Empire, Greek had quickly become the international language and also the language of the common people in that day. So then, why did the followers of Yeshua, the apostles, and other disciples in the first century begin to translate the Hebrew scriptures and the Gospels from Hebrew to Greek? Because Romans chapter 3, verse 1 and 2 says, "What then is the superiority of the Jew? Or what is the benefit of the circumcision? A great deal in every way. First of all, because they were entrusted with the sacred pronouncements of God." So since the Jews, the Hebrews, were entrusted with the sacred pronouncements of God, as mentioned in Romans chapter 3, verse 2, why did the followers of Yeshua and the other disciples and the apostles begin translating the Hebrew scriptures and the Gospels from Hebrew to Greek? These inspired men, all of them natural-born Jews, were inspired from the Most High. Therefore, their writings were sent out in Greek. Why? These were not private communications, private letters amongst just their own group. No, it was intended for wide circulation, to be read and studied by all the congregation. The writers were under divine command by Yah to spread this good news and teaching to the most distant part of the earth, to places where Hebrew and Latin were not read. Just as it is written in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, just before Yeshua ascended into the heavens, he said to the apostles, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit arrives upon you, and you will be witnesses of me, both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the most distant part of the earth." However, something else happened in the last half of the 2nd century CE. Notice what it says in John chapter 19, verses 19 and 20. Pilate wrote a title also and put it on the torture stake. It was written, "Yeshua the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." Therefore, many of the Jews read this title because the place where Yeshua was impaled was near the city. And it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Yes, something else happened in the last half of the 2nd century CE that had a major impact on language. The last half of the 2nd century saw a move on the part of the religious powers of Rome, of Christendom, to have Latin replace Greek as the language of the Roman Catholic bishops of Christendom. Thus, during the transatlantic slave trade, your ancestors from West Africa were being sent to countries where Latin was spoken, in time becoming French, Spanish, and English. But to our enslaved ancestors, it was made illegal for them to read. However, some of our ancestors were able to secretly read, What were they reading and in what languages? They were reading the Bible in French, Spanish, and English. Eventually, slavery was abolished in the Americas, and thus our ancestors were permitted to read, and read they did. So now do we see why the Most High Yah allowed His Word, the Bible, to be translated from Hebrew into other languages? It was to fulfill what was spoken in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where Yahshua said, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit arrives upon you, and you will be witnesses of me, both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria, and to the most distant part of the earth." So now we understand why Yeshua's followers, the apostles and the disciples in the first century, began to translate the Hebrew scriptures from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to other languages. It's so that the commission to preach and to spread the good news of Yeshua's teachings would reach to the most distant part of the earth. And that would include the Americas, would it not? So we can see the wisdom of the Most High in what He does, even though sometimes we do not understand or may not understand at a particular time in history. So let us keep this in mind, family. Let us stay awake because we are deep in the time of the end. Things are running out very quickly. If you like the content to my videos, please like, share, and subscribe so we can build this ministry and reach more people before the end comes, because time is on the essence. I have a new book that's going to be coming out that's going to be a sequel to The Lion of Shem and the Seed of Judah. Hopefully it will be coming out either latter June or early July 2025. And it will touch on many, many things. The Igbo, the Bambara, other different Hebrew West African peoples who were caught up in the transatlantic slave trade, and even in the Congo and Abyssinia. So that will be coming out soon. I will definitely share all the information with you. And also, it will also include a story about my family, an oral story in my family that my grandmother told me way back in 1989, that her father was a Hebrew Jew. And I was able to trace it back as far as I could go. And I'm going to also share the results with you in the next book as well, and my DNA test. So I'm very excited about it. So I will let you know, family. So please subscribe to my channel now so that you'll be able to get the notification when this next sequel comes out, and I'll be able to discuss it with you, break it down to you on video, and I hope you can pick up a copy and follow along as well. So until next time, friends, y'all please be safe.